Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to attend today or tonight, whatever time zone you're in. My name's Professor Darryl Higgins. I'm Director of the Institute of Child Protection Studies at Australian Catholic University, and we are delighted to present this webinar on behalf of the Global Safeguarding Alliance, which was formed in 2020. The aim of the GSA is to promote safeguarding, promote knowledge and exchange of ideas worldwide on the prevention of abuse of children and young people and other vulnerable persons. Understanding their experiences and providing them opportunities to inform our work helps us create evidence-informed solutions for services, systems, policies and practices. And these webinars are one way of sharing our knowledge in the hope of building the capacity of families, communities and workforces to prevent the abuse and neglect of children. And now onto the webinar for today, Safeguarding as Mission. It is based on a study by my lovely colleague, Gabby Hunt. Gabby conducted her work as part of her PhD studies that I helped supervise. And her thesis is focused on organisational risk factors for child sexual abuse in faith-based settings, based in part on data from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. Another part of her research also included interviews with Australian Christian religious leaders to learn about their perspectives on the current strengths and limitations of safeguarding practices. Gabby actually presented at the first GSA webinar back in April last year, where she shared her analysis of measures that are used to assess how successfully safeguarding aims are achieved in institutional settings. And since then, Gabby has submitted her thesis and has joined the Institute of Child Protection Studies as a research associate. And she's becoming a really solid voice for what we know about religious leaders' perceptions of safeguarding and child safety. Child safety in organisations has been the spotlight for all the wrong reasons here in Australia over the last few months due to recent child sexual abuse allegations in the childcare sector. Unfortunately, safeguarding practices in some organisations, including religious ones, are sometimes driven by just a tick the box and move on mentality. One of the participants in Gabby's research with religious leaders used this phrase during an interview. It's a chilling reminder of some of her findings are confronting, exposing, and some unconscious and cultural biases, she reveals. But she also suggests a way forward that reframes safeguarding as central to the mission and role of religious and non-religious organisations. And so I look forward to hearing more in the webinar. Before we hand over to Gabby, I'd like to also acknowledge Douglas Russell, who's letting people in from the Teams meeting that we've accidentally set up for today. He's a senior researcher at ICPS and he's coordinating our partnership work with the Global Safeguarding Alliance. And together we're building relationships with researchers, church leaders, safeguarding professionals and trauma specialists internationally. We're reaching audiences that include church leaders, ministers, clergy, religious men and women, and safeguarding managers. And Douglas will, throughout the seminar, keep an eye on your questions and manage some questions and answers at the end of Gabby's talk. So feel free to post any comments or questions in the chat during the presentation. And so now over to you, Gabby. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl, and welcome everyone. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about some of this research and hopefully hearing some really interesting discussion and questions at the end. I'll start by sharing my slides and then we'll get going for today. Okay, so as Daryl mentioned, my name is Gabrielle, but you can just refer to me as Gabby. And I'll be talking about this idea of safeguarding as mission and looking at the current barriers and evidence base for what's happening across Australia, and particularly in religious organisations, and what that means in terms of prevention strategies. Before we start, though, in Australia, we are home to the longest continuing living culture in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And as part of our practice of acknowledging and respecting their spiritual and cultural connection to land, we participate in what we call a acknowledgement of country, where we just acknowledge that the First Peoples or First Nations here in Australia are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live, work, and play. So I just want to extend my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as to any other Indigenous peoples who might be joining us today from across the globe. Welcome and thank you for the ways in which you've cared for our beautiful globe. I just want to acknowledge as well that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here in Australia have a really rich tradition of sharing knowledge. And so I'm really grateful that I can continue in that tradition with you all here today. So thank you. I also just want to note that, as Daryl mentioned, in our presentation today, we are going to be talking about some quite emotional and sensitive topics, such as child abuse and neglect, but also about religious organisations in general. And so, if at any point you're feeling distressed or in need of support, please feel free to take a break and do what you need to do to look after yourself, whether that's reaching out to family or professionals. I've also included some support services here for Australia if you need to reach out to anyone as well. Okay, so in my presentation today, I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of some of the new data we have about the prevalence and nature of child maltreatment here in Australia, including looking at specific findings that we have for experiences of child sexual abuse in religious organisations at a population level. And then I'm going to focus most of my talk on some of the key findings from my most recent paper, which was some qualitative interviews that I did with Christian religious leaders across the country. And during these interviews, we talked about some of the strengths, but also some of the barriers and limitations to safeguarding practices. And these findings, I think, will be particularly helpful to think about where to from here. What do we still need to do in religious organisations in order to enhance safety and well-being for children and young people in various different settings. So we'll finish the presentation today by talking about some practical strategies that different religious organisations might consider as they continue their work in this space. So firstly, many of you might be familiar with the Australian Child Maltreatment Study and some of their key findings. And for that reason, I'll do a very brief overview. But if you're interested to learn more, please have a look at the website. There's a huge amount of really helpful resources available there for anyone who's interested. But as a brief overview, the Australian Child Maltreatment Study was the first nationally representative study in Australia on the prevalence of child abuse and neglect, as well as their associated health outcomes. So over 8,500 people ages 16 to 65 plus were asked about their experiences of maltreatment during their childhood, as well as other types of adversity and how that impacted them throughout the life course. And so these findings were really quite they were really quite astounding, I think, to a lot of members of the public. It really shone a light onto how common child abuse and neglect is for young Australians. And so some of the key findings here show us that a good proportion of our population experiences abuse and neglect in their childhood. And you can see the statistics there broken down by the 5 types of child abuse and neglect, which include physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, as well as neglect and exposure to domestic violence. So we can see there that 28.5% of Australians experience sexual abuse during their childhood, which is a significant proportion of the population and has really important implications, not just for religious organisations, but for us as a community as a whole. What the Australian Child Maltreatment Study also showed was that these experiences of maltreatment for children are often chronic. It was actually quite more common for people to experience multiple types of abuse and neglect during their childhood. And we also saw that girls are disproportionately affected by most abuse types, particularly sexual and emotional abuse. So about 1 in 4 Australians have experienced 3 to 5 types of maltreatment, remembering that this is our 5 different types here. It's not just that children are experiencing a one-off incident. Much of the time, they're experiencing multiple different types of abuse and neglect. throughout their childhood. But as part of my PhD, I was also interested to understand the specific prevalence of sexual abuse in religious organizations. And so I was able to analyze data to look at when people said that they had experienced sexual abuse in their childhood, who had perpetrated that abuse. And so I was interested in those instances where people said that they'd experienced it by a leader or another adult in a religious organization. And what we found was that 1 in 250 Australians experienced child sexual abuse by a leader or other adult in a religious organisation. At the population level, this represents about 87,000 Australians. And so this is, while it is a less common type of child sexual abuse compared to sexual abuse perpetrated by parents or other family members, regardless, it has still affected a significant proportion of the population, and we have ongoing duty to address this type of harm and to improve outcomes for children and young people. What was an interesting finding about sexual abuse in religious organizations was that it actually disproportionately affects men compared to women. So about 0.8% of men said that they'd experienced this type of sexual abuse in their childhood compared to 0.1% of women. In particular, we saw that for older men, so these are men ages 65 years and older, that 1 in 45 of those men experienced this type of child sexual abuse. And so we can see that while child sexual abuse in religious organizations has decreased over the years, we still have ongoing work to do in this space, and including supporting older populations who've experienced this type of harm in their childhood. We also asked about what type of religious organization the sexual abuse occurred in, and we found that of all those who experienced sexual abuse in religious organizations, 71.9% said that it happened in a Catholic-run institution, with smaller proportions in other types of Christian denominations, such as Anglican or other Protestant groups, and then smaller still for non-Christian religious organizations. And then we also had a small proportion who refused to answer that particular question. And so there's lots of reasons why Catholic run organizations are overrepresented here. One of the reasons being that in Australia, Catholic organizations make up, quite a substantial amount of the education, childcare, welfare, health sector as well. And so just the exposure that young people would have had to Catholic run institutions was much higher. But we also know from other research across the globe that there are particular characteristics of the Catholic Church which may increase risk for sexual abuse in those settings compared to others as well. And so, as I mentioned, what we saw is that the prevalence of this type of abuse has declined with time. So the proportion of those 16 to 24 who say they've experienced this is much lower than those 45 to 64, and again for 65 years and over. This is in line with broader findings from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study as well, which showed that that rates of any kind of adult perpetrated sexual abuse have also declined over time. So by adult family members such as parents or other caregivers, as well as other types of institutional caregivers like teachers or childcare workers and things like that. And so we can be encouraged that the efforts that have happened across the Australian community and in organisations, have contributed to this decline. What's really important to note, though, is that this study was only able to capture instances that had been perpetrated by other adults. And so it doesn't capture experiences of sexual abuse by other children and young people that may have occurred in the context of a religious organization. And so this is likely a underrepresentation of the true prevalence of sexual abuse in religious organizations. But regardless, I'm sure many of you will agree that any amount of sexual abuse is not to be tolerated. And so there's still efforts that we have to make to improve the safety and well-being of children across society, including in religious organizations. Religious organizations, in particular, including in Australia, have I think, a really unique and important role in providing safety and support for families and for children and young people. Um, in Australia, and I'm sure this is the case elsewhere as well, religious organisations also operate many of our schools and our out-of-home care sectors as well. And so the just exposure that religious organisations have to provide support, to provide education, to provide protection for children and young people is really quite unlike any other type of organization in the country. And so I think there's a real responsibility that religious organizations have to be a leader in this space and to do this well. And we also know from the research that there are characteristics of religious organizations that can enable abuse to occur. And so it's really important that we work really hard to understand what those conditions are and to include consideration of that in our policies, in our practices. And so I think for religious organizations, they have a really kind of unique opportunity to provide early prevention and intervention, not just for child sexual abuse in religious organizations, but for all types of child maltreatment as well. And so, with that in mind, I was really interested as part of my PhD to understand what the safeguarding space looks like in religious organisations to date. Many of you will be aware that in Australia we had a Royal Commission that finished in 2018, and there was a huge kind of flurry of policy changes, legislation changes, and organisational practices that happened in the years following the Royal Commission's recommendations being handed down. But there's been pretty limited research to understand uh, what that implementation has actually looked like, if it's worked, and where we need to go to from here. And so, as part of my PhD, I was able to interview religious leaders about their perspectives on what's working well, what's not working so well, and where they see safeguarding needing to go in religious organizations. And so you'll see there that across the 20 religious leaders that I interviewed, I was able to capture quite a few different types of religious organizations, including from Catholic, Anglican, and other Christian denominations such as Baptist, Uniting Church, the Salvation Army, Lutheran Church, and others. And we also had a mix of different types of roles as well. So 60% of my sample had a specific ministry leadership role. So that could include something like a pastor, a minister, or a priest. And then 40% of my sample had a specific safeguarding management role as well. What's interesting to note from my sample, though, is that I had an overrepresentation of women. So over half my sample were women. Most of them were in this safeguarding management role component. And this is much higher compared to the rate of women in actual religious leadership in the country, which sits at about 22% from the latest study we have on that. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the findings that relate to that when we get there. But I'll start first by talking about some of the real strengths that were discussed by participants in current safeguarding practices. So firstly, it was really clear from my participants that them and the organisations that they worked for were very committed to safeguarding. They saw this as a important and intrinsic part of their role in the community. And so you'll see some participant quotes coming up on the screen as I talk about these different themes. And so this participant said that they'll do what's required. It's our responsibility. And this commitment was really evident in the way that participants talked about how things have changed since the Royal Commission. A lot of participants noted that the Royal Commission was quite a stressful time for a lot of religious organisations. There was a huge expectation to make a lot of changes on a lot of changes really quickly. And so that led to kind of a real rush to get things moving and to get things up to scratch or in line with the legislation of the particular jurisdiction. But it's been some time now, and so participants shared that since then, they've been able to mature some of those processes and have a much kind of deeper and clearer understanding of what's expected of them. And so participants shared that in the years since the Royal Commission, they've now got what they described as very well formulated policies and procedures that are kind of embedded into their organisational structure and practices. And nearly every participant talked about the Royal Commission and the role that that has had in safeguarding practice. And so a lot of participants talked about the importance of the Royal Commission recommendations and how they've informed their practices as well. While participants shared some of these strengths and I'll talk a little bit later on as well about some of the future directions and how some of those things have been put into practice already. Participants also shared some real limitations and barriers to safeguarding in their settings, and so we'll talk about those a little bit now. Ultimately, participants shared that while they felt that there's been some real positive changes to policy and practice, that there's still a need for cultural change within religious organisations. Many participants that I interviewed shared that they felt that there was still a real cultural issue within religious organisations that acted as a real barrier to making some of the meaningful changes that are needed to keep children and young people safe. And so, how this manifested within these kind of six themes or kind of six barriers. This first one is this idea of safeguarding being experienced as just trying to tick the box and move on, just trying to comply with the legislation and not think too much about what that actually means for their practice. And so many participants shared struggles with getting people to really understand how important safeguarding is, and that many people just had this attitude of just trying to tick the box so that people stop bothering me about everything that I need to do in this space. And so, really, for a lot of participants, they talked about this idea that safeguarding is often seen as an external regulation, that it's the legislation of the jurisdiction that they're in that is kind of infringing on the church and what they would like to do. And so, a lot of participants shared that they really struggle to get people in their community, people in their congregation to see that safeguarding is actually a really important part of their role of it as an organization because it's just seen as something that is external and a kind of requirement of them by the state or something like this. And so for a lot of people, they share that this can mean that religious leaders and volunteers can feel quite fatigued by what's required of them from a safeguarding perspective. Here in Australia, there's expectations to have working with children checks, to have really good data retention policies, to, in some states and territories, to have reportable conduct schemes and things like that. And so there's a huge kind of administration task that goes into meeting these requirements. And for a lot of organizations, this can be extremely burdensome, particularly for those that are volunteer run and might have limited resources to spend on the labor required to actually do the safeguarding work that's required of them. So, for example, I had participants sharing with me that they might, in their jurisdiction or in their diocese or whatever kind of term is relevant for that denomination, might have really large churches who have multiple staff and can afford to pay for someone to be a safeguarding manager or something like this. And so they can, more easily do what is required of them. But other churches might have no paid staff or might only have a part-time priest or a part-time minister who comes in on a Sunday and might just occasionally answer the phones. Um, and the requirements that they have are the same as those really large churches. And so that can be really difficult then to get the kind of labor that they need to be able to do what's required of them. Participants also talked about this idea that there can be particular characteristics that mean that people reject or downplay the importance of safeguarding. And so, for example, participants talked about for a lot of older generations where they might have been volunteering for 40 or 50 years. They've been doing their work in a particular way for a long time, and now they have to do it in a different way. And so getting um, older generations to kind of buy into what they need to do now can be quite difficult. And there's also many settings where religious organizations might get religious leaders from other parts of the world, maybe where safeguarding is not well understood. And so they come to the Australian context where it's quite heavily regulated in comparison, and they can find that quite difficult to adjust to the expectations that the Australian context would have on a religious leader compared to elsewhere in the world. Many participants also talked about this idea that there are certain religious teachings and theologies that can really conflict with modern safeguarding practices. And so you'll get some people who might find it difficult, for example, to comply with certain legislation like conversion practice bans, as an example. And lastly, we also heard from participants that there's still this kind of culture of denying the reality and the seriousness of abuse in the church. I had one participant tell me a story where they had a previous priest who was currently in prison for sexual abuse of a child, and they still had people in that parish saying there's no way that he did that. And so when you have these kind of attitudes of denying abuse, even when you have a conviction in place, it can really lead to a culture where children are not believed, and where survivors are not believed. And so then it leads to a risk of then safeguarding not being taken as seriously as it needs to be in religious organizations. So, where to from here? What do we do with these kinds of barriers that were identified by the participants that I spoke with? Well, many of the participants I had already done a lot of work in their organization, much of the time, to come up with strategies and solutions to address some of these problems. I've included some of these ideas here in this kind of future directions, because a lot of these ideas were kind of being very informally tried by different participants, and they weren't really fully embedded in the practice of religious organizations, at least from those that I interviewed. And so I think these future directions that I'll talk about now give real kind of direction and opportunities for continuous improvement in this space. This first one here is this idea of embedding safeguarding as part of the mission of religious organizations. Participants shared that this idea of safeguarding as being external regulation and burdensome and fatiguing is really draining for many people. And so when they were able to use language like this is part of the mission, you know, that um, this is part of what we need to be doing, you know, um, to operate in our mission or whatever it might be, that this was really energizing for leadership. And so I think this is a real opportunity for leaders and organizations to think about how safeguarding is talked about in your organization, and kind of using language that inspires people to understand how important this is. Participants also shared that there's a real need for enhanced and rigorous training and support for leadership. Some shared that there's been some really great training out there, but it's really not consistent across religious organizations. And there was a real kind of sense that there's a need for more quality training and also more support as well, whether that be supervision or oversight for different leaders as well and volunteers, and a need to even evaluate the effectiveness of training as well. Participants also shared that there's lots of opportunities to share learning and collaboration between religious organizations and also between denominations themselves. And I've been lucky to be part of some groups that are starting to do this as well, particularly when you think about the kind of administrative task that's often required of religious organizations. If they can share their learning, share their resources, this would go a long way, I think, to reducing some of that burden that's on volunteers and leaders. Participants also shared that there's been a real understanding and appreciation of the importance of protecting children and young people, but this hasn't always extended to understanding that anyone at any age can actually experience harm in a religious organization. And so there was a call from a lot of participants to include adults in consideration of safeguarding practices as well. And that this is starting in some places, but there's still a lot of work still to do in this space. Participants also shared that they wanted to prioritize listening to and acting on the voices of children and survivors. I heard some really great examples from different organizations about how they've started to do this in different areas, but it certainly came through that this is something that is not well embedded across religious organizations. And so participants talked about the need to actually involve children and survivors in policy development, in risk assessment, in planning of different activities. If we're going to be designing a policy, it should be informed by those that it's intended to protect. And these last 2 points here, I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. So that's why I've bolded them here. This first one is about addressing the gender dimensions of safeguarding. And the second one, which I'll talk about later, is about moving from just focusing on perpetrators to contexts in prevention. But I'll talk first about this gender dimension of safeguarding. You might remember when I introduced this study that I mentioned that I had an overrepresentation of women in my sample. And it was really clear from the women that I interviewed that they saw themselves, experienced themselves as predominant drivers for safeguarding in their organizations. It became clear that it might very often be women who are tasked with safeguarding responsibilities in religious organizations. And so, what that meant for the women that I interviewed was that this meant that they really had to work really hard in their particular position, oftentimes because they're excluded from particular types of leadership in specific religious organizations. And also because even if they are allocated as a leader in a safeguarding manager role or something like that, the decision-making power that they have is really quite limited. And so even though they might be tasked with safeguarding management, whether they actually had any kind of meaningful power or decision making or kind of agency in that role was really quite limited a lot of the time. And so women that I interviewed described themselves often as having to be salespeople for safeguarding. They explained that when they would go and provide training or talk to different groups about the importance of safeguarding or about the expectations that are on different leaders, that they came up against a lot of resistance and even things like aggression and anger from leaders, which are predominantly men. And so they had to be really careful about their messaging and kind of morph into this role of being a salesperson, that they had to give a pitch why safeguarding is important. And so this represents a really I think, concerning dynamic that's happening between safeguarding managers, which are predominantly women, and religious leaders, which are predominantly men. And so, what that meant is that women often then had to present safeguarding as being about protecting leadership, because that is what got kind of compliance and buy-in from leaders and volunteers, rather than saying this is actually really important to protect children and young people, which I would argue is really what it's all about. And so I think an underlying kind of factor contributing to this issue is that because safeguarding is seen as regulation, is seen as administrative work, this means that a lot of the time it's seen as women's work because administration historically has been deemed as women's work. And so, as one participant explained to me, a lot of the time, male leadership perceive their role as pastoral care, preaching, and leadership, and not about the administrative responsibilities. And so that means that women are then having to do a lot of labor, a lot of emotional labor to get buy in from leaders to understand how important safeguarding is as part of the mission of religious organizations. And second point that I really wanted to hone in on is this idea that many of the practices and policies that we've seen across organizations, including religious ones, have really been focused on preventing adult perpetrators of sexual abuse from joining religious leadership or volunteer roles, training adults to identify abuse early, and responding to abuse which has already occurred. And so there's kind of this idea of if we can identify these bad adults and kind of gatekeep them out of spaces where there are children, and we can teach adults how to respond if something bad happens, then everything will be safe. But what we know from the evidence base is that it is often the environment and the context which create and enable the conditions that allow for abuse to occur in the first place. And so I think there's a real need to move from just trying to identify and respond to bad adults to actually thinking about how we can create safe environments and safe contexts and communities. And so for me, I think this means that we also need to consider other forms of maltreatment and adversity in our policies and practices. That we need to think about how we're supporting parents and families in healthy and supportive parenting practices. And it also means that we need to be thinking about how we address risks between peers. We know from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study that while adult perpetrated sexual abuse has declined with time, rates of child sexual abuse inflicted by adolescents or other children and young people has increased. And so that means that about 1 in 5 Australians aged 16 to 24 have experienced sexual abuse by another child or young person. And so trying to have a safeguarding practice that's just about identifying and responding to bad adults is going to completely miss this really pressing issue that we have here in Australia and likely globally as well. And so, what does contextual safeguarding look like in practice? Well, we've already talked a bit about this idea of embedding safeguarding in mission. And so, I think it's really important that when we're thinking about our safeguarding practices, our policies, that we're thinking about how are we talking about this in our meetings? How are we talking about it with our leaders during a board meeting or during the training that we're running? Are we talking about how this is kind of embedded in the very purpose and mission of the religious organization? Or are we just presenting it as something that they just need to do just to be able to volunteer in a group? We also need to think about what are the resources that might constrain leaders and volunteers from engaging in some of these things. Do we need to think about how we're supporting our volunteers and our leaders to be able to do what's required of them? We also need to think about how we're challenging cultural norms and attitudes that enable abuse to, to occur in the first place. So we need to think about, on a Sunday morning, are our priests, are our ministers um, talking about abuse? Are they talking about the importance of children's well-being and safety? Does everyone in our religious organization understand the expectations of them and where they can go to for support? Is it also really clear in our organization how we report concerns and who to? And are they trusted by those in our organization? Would a child know how and where to report without having to speak to another adult or to a parent? We also need to think about how we're enabling and empowering those in safeguarding positions to do the work that they need to do. So I think it's really important to think about how we are empowering those that are tasked with these roles, which from my research sounds like might be a lot of women. How are they being empowered and resourced to act in their role? And are we ensuring that we are representing diverse voices in our leadership so that we can be aware of our blind spots in different matters? We also need to think about the training and resources that are available to our organizations as well. I think for this, that means that we need to be evaluating the actual effectiveness of our training as well. So thinking about, are we actually checking that this is improving people's knowledge and attitudes, that when they leave this training, that they're feeling confident, informed, and supported to do what they need to do. We also need to be thinking about our training, if it's actually practical and relevant to those that are attending the training as well. It's all well and good to have many volunteers or leaders come to a training, but if it's not actually relevant to the context that they're in or to the work that they're doing, then it's likely that they're going to feel quite disempowered and quite leave quite feeling like, oh, I'm not sure what the purpose of that was. But if we can make it actually really grounded and practical in the work that they're doing and the context that they're in, then I think that will actually improve outcomes as well for people. We also need to think about the physical environments that children are in as well. So when children are in different spaces, who else is there? Are there always two adults present? Can we think creatively about the spaces that we run our activities in? Do we need to make sure that it's in an open area with glass windows rather than in a back cupboard because they're too noisy to be in the main hall or something like that? It's about being really resourceful and creative about the environments and thinking practically about where children are going, who else is there, and how we can make sure that the actual environment itself is safe. That means doing risk assessments for activities such as camps, youth groups, or other informal gatherings as well. And I think for me, that means that children and young people need to be involved in those processes as well. If we listen to children and young people, I think we'd learn a lot about what they need, what they see that many adults might not notice themselves. So, on the idea of kind of clear codes and recruitment as well, we also need to think about do we have clear codes of conduct for everyone, and are they clearly accessible and well understood? And do we have support processes in place for our volunteers and our leaders as well? And then lastly, we need to be thinking about risks between peers as well. It was really clear from the participants that I spoke to that this is a real pressing issue for a lot of religious organizations. And I know even from talking with different schools as well that this is now one of the most common things that they are having to deal with over and above things like bullying. And so I think there's a real need to think proactively about how we're addressing risks between peers in religious organizations as well, which for me includes things like providing education and support around consent, respectful relationships, and boundaries, and making sure that children and young people have clear reporting guidelines and they're empowered themselves to share and be believed by the adults about the concerns that we have. And I've talked already a few times about listening to the voices of children and survivors. So I think I've made that kind of message really clear. But what we know from the research as well is that for children and young people, it's not just about that they are safe; they also need to feel safe in religious organizations. And so I think the only way that we're really going to know that children and young people feel safe is if we ask them and involve them in the planning and policy development and risk assessments and things like that as well. And so, in summary, we know that child maltreatment and adversity are extremely common across Australia in the family, in our institutions, and also between children and young people as well. So, while we've seen that rates of child sexual abuse by adults have declined, there's still a lot of work to do. We still have an unacceptable rate of child sexual abuse in general. But we also see that this increase in risks between peers is really pressing for a lot of organisations. And religious organisations can play a really important role in prevention and response and in supporting parents and community. And so I think for that, that means that we need to really shift our thinking and our mindset to not just trying to tick the box, not just trying to meet the regulation standards of the jurisdiction that we're in, that we actually need to think about how we're creating safe environments and safe communities for our children and young people. And so I think that's a whole of community responsibility, and religious organizations can do a lot of work to supporting families, to supporting parents, schools, and children themselves to be safe, no matter where they are in the community. And so, if you're interested in any of the research that we've talked about today, please feel free to reach out to me or to Daryl or Douglas. But I've listed a few links there for anyone that's interested. Otherwise, that brings us to the end, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and talking more. So, thank you, everyone.
Well done, Gabby. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. And it's great to see that theoretical approach of contextual safeguarding being brought in and really focusing not just on weeding out bad people, but looking at the environment and how, as a faith-based community, that different organizations would be able to wrap around and keep children and potentially, as you said, adults safe. So we definitely do have some questions here. One of them is in relation to the constraints of not having adequate people or an adequate number of people. And as a result, safeguarding is compromised. And the question essentially is it that short staffing and financial constraints are playing a role there? Is that something that any of the participants in your research specifically mentioned as a reason?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Douglas. It definitely was something that participants talked about because we know that many religious organizations rely on volunteers for a lot of their ministry and their activities. And so a lot of the time it was actually just not having the people who had the time or the skills to be able to do working with children checks, to have a database of everyone that's done the training and all of that kind of thing. And so a lot of participants talked about the need to think really creatively about how religious organizations are going to have the people that they need to do this work. And so I think that's why a lot of participants shared the importance of actually lightening the load by sharing resources, sharing learnings between religious organizations. Even just as a practical example, participants shared that it's not uncommon for a volunteer at a church, let's say, to also volunteer at a school or to also volunteer at another religious organization like a youth group or a camp or something like that. And so they would have to make sure that they do the training at every single organization that they are at. And if that crosses jurisdiction, so say they're in New South Wales and they want to go to a youth camp in the ACT, that requires a different working with children check a lot of the time. And so there's a lot of kind of system level practical constraints as well that are at play. But I think there's probably some real practical things that religious organizations themselves can do in terms of streamlining that process for volunteers. Yeah, I don't see a need why you would need to do training at four different organizations necessarily. There might be like organization specific things that you have to do, but I think a lot of that can be really streamlined to reduce resource burden and fatigue for a lot of people. I hope that answers that question.
I'm just going to come in here and keep asking
Mm.
questions. Unfortunately, Zoom has died for Douglas. So
Oh no.
he's still on screen, but
Okay.
he's not able to participate. So were there any gendered impacts with regard to reporting as well? Was that something that participants talked about?
Do you mean in terms of like responding to disclosures or?
Yeah, so that was Amy who was asking the question. Do you want to add anything to that? Whether maybe Gabby, if you can just talk about whether participants
Mm,
referred to, the task, if you like, of making a report. I'm assuming that Amy's talking about, hearing a disclosure and
yeah.
responsibility to report, whether it be to, a superior within the religious
Mm,
organisation and to external authorities.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and sorry, just to clarify as well, I was curious about because there were a lot more women involved in the administration,
Mm,
um, but even so, in a religious organization, they actually may not be the top person who has to make
hmm.
a final report. So,
Mm.
are there any issues in regards to reporting there
Yeah.
as well?
Okay, yeah, really interesting. Yeah, to be honest, it's probably not something that really came through in the interviews that I had. Although in other conversations I've had with various people, they have talked about this idea that often that it's not them themselves that have to make the report, it's their superior. And even in a lot of schools, that's the case too. It's not like if a teacher, for example, receives a disclosure, it's not them that would make the report. It would be their deputy principal or their guidance officer or whatever the reporting line might be. Um, but in terms of the impact that that might have, that was not really something that was talked about. But I imagine that that could potentially be a challenge or a barrier for some people. Um, yeah, I guess in the Australian context, we have pretty strict and clear guidelines around mandatory reporting that have been pretty well accepted, I think, across a variety of organizational settings. And so, yeah, I imagine it might be harder for someone to dismiss the need for a report when yeah, but that doesn't mean that doesn't happen. I'm sure that it might, but yeah, our mandatory reporting regulation has been pretty well accepted, I think, across organizational settings. Daryl, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's right. We might move on
Mm,
to the next question. Kushal raised the question about financial kind of resourcing and suggested a
mm,
possible solution of having a coalition of people
mm.
working together across smaller organizations. And
Yeah.
Blaine is also asking, do we have any kind of costing study about how much it costs for
Mm.
individual churches to put in place safeguarding mechanisms? So any comments or thoughts on those kind of two issues?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's, I think, a really great suggestion. Yeah, I think it makes absolute sense to just share the load between organizations, particularly those that, might not have enough staff or to do that work on their own. Yes, but in terms of what it costs, I'm not sure, but that would be a really interesting thing
Mm.
to explore in terms of um, yeah, what the labor and hours actually would look like for someone to do that on a yearly basis or whatever it
Mm.
might be. Um, I imagine the larger the organization, potentially the more resources. But yeah, and it might depend too on the types of activities you do. Like if you're doing a lot of children's ministries, obviously you're going to have more risk there. But if you're just a small parish with no children's ministries at all, then it might be um, fairly easier. But yeah, it'd be interesting to find out the cost.
Yes. Um,
Mm,
Jay from Body Safe Australia was asking about the role of faith itself as a tool for
mm,
grooming. So whether that's something that participants talked about at all, or whether you have any
mm.
thoughts or reflections about that, Gabby.
Yeah, absolutely. We know from other research that often religious teachings are used as part of preventing disclosure and facilitating abuse itself, whether that's by, teaching children that if they tell anyone that they're going to go to hell or something like that. And so, yeah, we have lots of previous research to show how religious teachings are used to facilitate abuse itself. Um, that itself wasn't specifically talked about by my participants, but what they did talk about is that in a similar way that some religious teachings can act as barriers to kind of supporting or taking on board particular safeguarding ideas or practices
Mm.
themselves. Yeah.
Gabby, you heard from participants about some of the kind of negative things that they observed in their,
Hmm.
their organization, their religious setting, like, the box ticking, the safeguarding fatigue, the
Hmm.
state infringing, the denial of the reality of abuse. Did you get a sense of what it felt like, the emotional impact for those people? Because it sounds like the individuals themselves had the polar opposite view, and what it was like to
Mm.
experience that kind of dissonance, if you like. Mm.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Because I think for the participants that I had, they were extremely passionate, very committed, very knowledgeable about safeguarding and what was needed. And so I think for a lot of the participants that I interviewed, I could sense frustration from them. But ultimately, I think a lot of them had a lot of hope as well um, about what could change and what could happen in their organization.
Mm.
And so even if they were experiencing frustration or or even, quite upset about things that had happened, there was still a sense of hope, I think, from those that I interviewed. And I think that was really evident in the knowledge that they had and the ideas they had for
Mm.
future directions as well. Mm,
Fantastic. 1 minute to go. Very quick question, Gabby.
mm,
You worked on a study with 8,500 participants. You also designed and conducted your own study with 20 participants.
mhm.
What was the difference, and how did it feel working with very different perspectives? Mm.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because in a lot of ways they're very different ways of working because the Australian Child Maltreatment Study is huge data set. It's a lot of people and it's quantitative work, and so you're kind of dealing with numbers, and so sometimes it can be really easy to kind of lose sight of these are real people with who've had
Mm.
real experiences. Um, and so hearing from and talking to the participants, I think, was really grounding because um, I always try to remind myself that when I'm talking about, these numbers, these statistics, that these represent real
Mm.
people who've been
Yeah.
really affected by what's happening. And so it's kind of encouraging
Mm.
then to talk to those that are on the ground, those that are
Yeah.
working with these people who are affected, and hear from them that they're working really hard. They have
Mm.
a lot of
Mm.
commitment to doing better, and
Yeah.
even though there's some barriers there, that there's a lot of hope and things that we can do
Mm.
to improve outcomes for children. So, yeah, thanks for that
Thanks.
question.
Yeah, and speaking of which, thank you to all of the people who've posted comments and suggestions. We've had resources from the UK, from Australia, from New Zealand.
Mm,
So please make sure that you look those up. We'll include those
yeah.
in the recording and a summary of this. So please look out for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, but mostly thank you, Gabby, for a really insightful and a beautifully done presentation. So please join me in thanking Gabby and enjoy the rest of your day or evening. And thank you for coming along to this GSA webinar. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.